We've been the last, I think it's 3 weeks, we've been exploring the Dharma Jewel, and we started off with talking about the Four Noble Truths, the last of which is the path to liberation, so the path to that leads to the end of suffering and to liberation. And in the and that path is the Eightfold, Noble Path, which we've been exploring over the last couple of weeks. And Stivanaga started us off by talking about what we call right or perfect view. And then last week we talked about perfect emotion, and this week we're going to talk about right speech. And Rakesh said it was one of her favourite. And strange enough, it's one of my. This sounds a bit of an odd thing to say. It's one of my favourite limbs of the Eightfold Path too. So yeah. So Ed, could we have the first slide up? Thank you. So I'm trying to sort of encapsulate quite a lot on this. So this shows the 8 aspects of the path, and it also correlates it to the threefold way, or the threefold path, which and I just think it's just quite a useful way of looking at it, isn't it? So that we've got the 2 wisdom aspects, so perfect view and perfect emotion or intention, and then we've got the 3 aspects of ethics: speech, action, and livelihood, and then the 3 aspects of meditation. And we also taught, and so Stivanaga talked in the first week about how we can split this into what we call the path of vision, which is our kind of is a kind of is the kind of aspect of insight. So there's a sort of initial insight, or which kind of gets us going on the path, and then there's what we call the path of transformation. So it's a bit like we see something, don't we? We just have a sense of how things are, and that kind of inspires us to transform. Well, to try to transform our lives. And, so the next 7 aspects all form that path of transformation. So thanks for that, Ed. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about those aspects of the path that correspond to ethics, and they're all related. So the next 3 areas are speech, action, and livelihood, and in one way or another, these all relate to action. So from a Buddhist perspective, when we're talking about speech, we regard that as an action. So just to say something about the kind of links between the various areas. So we talked last week about emotion and perfect emotion, and then we talked about perfect vision, and they're all linked, aren't they? So it's through developing and cultivating that vision that we're able to transform our kind of emotional nature. And we talked about the need to kind of integrate ourselves and the importance of positive emotion, so that we can bring more and more of our kind of energy behind this kind of process of transformation. And then, of course, there's a very obvious link between our kind of emotional nature and the actions that we undertake. Those actions are all well, yeah, our kind of emotional nature. Yeah. So anyway, moving on specifically to speech, and when we talk about perfect speech as part of the path, we're talking about all aspects of communication. Um, this includes, well, all communication, including all kind of modern forms of, communication, all our kind of social media stuff, all our tweeting and bits and pieces like that. So, yeah. And one of the reasons I like this aspect of the path is I just always have this sense that we hugely underestimate the impact of speech, on ourselves, and in particular the impact our speech has on others. There's many things through my life that I've really regretted saying, and also there's many things that people have said to me that I'm still very kind of conscious of, and have hurt me, have hurt me very much. But I also think our speech can just have a tremendously kind of positive effect on other people. And I've just got a little quote from Sangharakshita. He says, kindly speech is like the warm rays of the sun that cause leaves to expand and flowers to open. I just think it's a sort of lovely piece of, it's just lovely kind of imagery, and it just kind of captures something just the really sort of positive effect that speech can have. And of course, there's also the sort of well-known quote, isn't there, that words are mightier than the sword. And so often I think we can communicate kind of quite carelessly in a way, without a lot of regards for the importance of what we're saying. And sometimes I think we just talk, don't we? Sometimes we just talk, and it's really just a kind of verbalizing our thoughts without necessarily a lot of without a lot of thought going into it, actually. Yeah. So in terms of what right speech is, the Buddha talked about 5 aspects of, I'm using the terms right and perfectly interchangeably, so you'll have to slightly excuse me. But in terms of perfect speech, the Buddha talked about 5 aspects. Could we have the next slide, Ed? Thank you. So we've got the aspects that are skillful, and those aspects that are unskillful. So we'll go through each of these individually. So we've got truthful, kindly, helpful, which is sometimes sometimes described as meaningful speech, harmonious and timely speech, and in terms of the unskillful aspects, we've got untruthful, harsh, unhelpful, which again is sometimes kind of translated as useless or frivolous, and then unharmonious or slanderous, and then untimely speech. Thank you, Ed. Yeah. So, in a way, a lot of this is obvious, but there's quite a lot of kind of subtleties in some of this. So, truthful communication is around kind of factual accuracy in some regards, and I guess in its grossest form, the unskillful aspect is lying. But of course, it's much more subtle, and there's the whole way in which we kind of communicate, and you know, we tend to emphasize certain things in our communication, or we might exaggerate what we say, or we say something in a way that leaves a lot to be kind of read between the lines, and generally a lot of our communication in quite a subtle way is all geared around, really geared around getting what we want. Yeah, it might be how we want others to perceive us, or we might want to kind of curry favour in some kind of way, and so we might think we might actually think our communication is very truthful, but often actually we are, you know, we are trying to kind of manipulate the situation, aren't we, to get what we want. But conversely, I think there's a really sort of deep integrity in just saying things as they are. Actually, yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of integrity in it, and I think there's also a sense that if we're not communicating truthfully, or at least trying to, in a way, we're not communicating at all, are we? I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, communication really only has any value if it is if it is truthful. But of course, it's not always easy, is it? Because we don't necessarily know what we're thinking all the time, or how we're feeling. So, you know, sometimes we might feel one thing in the morning and feel the opposite in the afternoon, and obviously, you know, that gets reflected in our communication as well. So truthful communication, you know, isn't as simple as it might necessarily appear. And then the next aspect is kindly communication. So yeah, so kindly communication is communication that is kind of rooted in love and affection for the other person, and its opposite, harsh speech, is obviously well, yeah, not based on affection. And this is where it's in this context that Sangharakshita talks about love being the awareness of the being of another person. So he talks about kindly speech really being grounded and based on a kind of deep awareness. Yeah, just a kind of deep awareness of the other person. And very often when we're talking to someone, we don't necessarily have that awareness of the other person. I mean, sometimes it's like sort of two people, you know, sometimes conversations can just be like kind of two people talking at kind of cross purposes, and barely kind of seeing the other person at all. Yeah, this aspect of kindly communication is just really based on a kind of sense of yeah, a kind of awareness of that person. And it also, I think, requires us to have a sense of what they really need. Yeah, and to really be able to see that person as they are. And often, again, I think, you know, we tend to have views of people, don't we? And sometimes when we're talking to them, it's a bit like we're talking to a kind of projection. We like talking to our projection of that person rather than really seeing them as they are. So that's the second aspect. So we've got truthful, we've got kindly, and then the third aspect is helpful communication. So when we're talking to someone, how often do we think whether what we are saying to them is truly helpful? And I think when we talk about communication and speech being helpful, we're talking about whether it helps them to really develop and grow as a person. Yeah. And sometimes actually our communication with others can be quite undermining of them, can't it? Yeah, I'm sure we can all think of instances, yeah, where our communication hasn't really kind of helped them to grow or develop. And this isn't to say, so when we talk about helpful communication, it's not that we should never be critical of others. But it needs to be, it needs to kind of be truthful, and it also needs to be kind, and it also needs to be kind of constructive and objective. So I think this is particularly important, isn't it? If we are going to give someone feedback on something that, you know, that they may have said or they may have done, is what I'm about to say going to really help? Going to really kind of help that other person? So that's the third aspect. We've got truthful, kindly, and helpful, and then moving on. We've got harmonious speech. So, does our speech create harmony? Yeah, and there's a sort of there's a sort of transcendental aspect to this quality of kind of harmony. So it's a bit like when we communicate at our absolute best, and it's really based on someone else's needs and actually seeing someone else. It's a bit like we're able to go beyond ourselves. You know, we're not sort of communicating from our own sense of ego. We're really seeing the other person, and it has this kind of transcendental kind of aspect to it, this harmonious communication. So I think this is really sort of communication at quite a refined level. Yeah. And then finally, the Buddha talked about the importance of the timeliness of our communication. So there definitely is a right time to say things, isn't there, and a time that isn't. And yeah, I'm sure we've all had experience of that. Yeah. So those are the 5 aspects, and I was just going to say a little bit about kind of right speech as a practice. And yeah, so last week we talked about perfect emotion, and as I said before, perfect emotion and right speech, or really any of our actions, are just very they're very closely linked. And we talked last week about the importance of integration and positive emotion. And the more integrated we are, and the more of ourself we are able to kind of put behind our practice, and the more positive we are emotionally, then naturally our speech will just become more skillful. Yeah. And I also think sort of perfect speech is it is a very good kind of mindfulness practice, and with a bit of effort, we can just really start to recognize what we are about to say before we say it, which, I mean, that's not always the case. It's certainly not always the case with me. Sometimes it's like, oh, where are these words coming from? But you know, with a bit of practice, we can just really, well, just start to be very conscious of what we are about to say. And in a way, we develop a kind of freedom to choose what we're going to say. Yeah, so it's like we develop this kind of freedom, and we can determine what we're going to say and kind of who we're going, how we're going to say it and how we're going to say it as well. Yeah, so there's a kind of liberation that we can get through practicing practicing perfect speech. Yeah, and also of course we can learn. We can just learn to refine our speech. Yeah, and also not to speak out of kind of negative emotions. Yeah. Yeah, just one final thing in terms of sort of speech as a practice. I think it's quite kind of insightful to notice the link between what we're saying and the kind of felt experience in the body. So often, if we are communicating poorly, there's a kind of agitation in the body or the heart or the mind too, and we might notice that when we communicate well, that we have it's the opposite effect. There's a kind of calming in the body. Yeah, I was just going to mention 3 other aspects of communication that may not be immediately apparent. The first is the importance of listening as part of our communication, and I guess I just increasingly find that it's a sort of essential part. It's an essential part of communication, is to be able to listen, and also the importance of silence as well. We have this kind of I mean, I notice it when I'm kind of anxious or something. I get a bit kind of neurotic, and I just kind of fill the space with words. And actually, there's a great power in silence, and there's a great if you've been on a silent retreat or a retreat where there's been a lot of silence, you'll kind of witness the kind of power as a way of kind of communicate, and how much good communication can happen in silence. And the last aspect was trust. So just the importance of trust in communication. I just I always hope I don't kind of fall into kind of naivety or something, but I think there's just something about implicitly trusting people when we're in communication with them, and not kind of falling into cynicism. So I'm going to finish with a short poem. So could we have the next slide, Ed? This is a Waiyoking poem. So, if you speak delusions, everything becomes a delusion. If you speak the truth, everything becomes the truth. Outside the truth, there is no delusion, but outside delusion, there is no special truth. Followers of the Buddha's way, why do you earnestly seek the truth in distant places? Look for delusion and truth in the bottom of your own hearts. Thank you, Ed. It just captures, actually, I think, the link between kind of perfect speech and perfect emotion, but also just this idea that really unless we're kind of communicating the complete truth, then in a sense it isn't the truth at all. So, yeah. So that's all I have to say.